so much, Dewan, for the introduction. And I'm so excited to be able to share knowledge with you. So as we are all aware, COVID-19 has been a risk to both our health as well as our well-being. Because for us to thrive, we must survive COVID. We cannot reach our goals. We cannot fight for social justice and for change. We cannot achieve our highest potentials unless we survive this pandemic. And this pandemic has been a major disruptor. Over 10 million people have lost their jobs and livelihoods. Millions of families have been touched. And who knew that we would so much miss the hugs and the kisses and the interactions? But in addition to the trauma to our way of life and well-being, there've also been so many lives that have been lost. Over 500,000 lives have been lost across all ages, ethnicities, and social status. And our loss has truly been great. But our loss has not been equally borne. Black, Brown, Latino, and Indigenous peoples have been disproportionately affected. And it's because of income equality. We have to work during this pandemic. It's because systemic disparities in the quality and access to healthcare. And it's because of underlying conditions and a host of other factors have it that minorities are disproportionately dying from COVID. This is going to really focus this presentation on the minority community, and over 63,000 of the COVID deaths have been Black lives. And when adjusted for age, Black, Latino, and Indigenous lives are lost at twice the rate of our white counterparts. And Pacific Islander lives are lost at an astounding 3 times the rate. And so a crisis of inequality has become a crisis of survival. And now there's a vaccine. And we're skeptical, and it's understandable. There are legitimate concerns, especially for minorities. There is well-founded distrust based on our history, the Tuskegee study, Henry Lax, and so on. But one doesn't have to go all the way back to that history to see examples of disrespect, mistreatment, and violation from the very systems that are intended to help. There's a lack of clear information versus the apparent abundance of misinformation. And there's a lack of healthcare professionals who we know, love, and trust, and who trust us. In addition, there are legitimate questions about safety, especially about a vaccine that is so recently come onto the market. Questions around how the vaccine was developed so quickly and why people who were not interested in engaging with us before are now very anxious and recommending for us to be vaccinated. So these are legitimate questions, and we do deserve clear and accurate information, and we deserve honest and thoughtful answers. And so that is the intent for the seminar today. We are hoping to begin this conversation. We hope to provide insights into the COVID vaccine in the hope that it will be useful both to you as well as to your families. So we're going to start our discussion today just talking about how vaccines work. And as you're aware, vaccines work by triggering the immune system, giving our bodies a competitive edge in order to fight diseases. Now, the first vaccine was developed way back in 1796, and it was for smallpox, which at that point was a deadly disease that was ravaging large parts of the globe. And the principles that are used to develop this first vaccine are the same principles that are being used to develop vaccinations today, namely that an innocuous form of the virus, an attenuated or milder form is used and is looked for or designed, and a small amount of that innocuous form is then given as the vaccine. So for smallpox, cowpox was used because it's similar to smallpox, but it's much, much milder than smallpox. And so in that first vaccination, a small amount of cowpox was used in that first vaccination. And what happens in the body has now become the basis of modern immunology. We now know that memory cells within the adaptive immune system are trained to be able to fight that specific disease, building up long-term antibodies for long-term immunity. That first vaccination for smallpox was, in the history of the world, was an incredible success. countries all over the world decided to collaborate together, encourage their citizens to be vaccinated. And today, smallpox has been completely eradicated from the face of the globe. And since then, vaccines have become powerful tools, and we now have vaccines against measles, mumps, smallpox, chickenpox, polio, hepatitis, and the common flu. So that's a little bit about the history. And now let's talk about the COVID vaccine in particular. And this has unique challenges because of the deadly and contagious nature of this virus. Because remember, we said that if you're taking a flu vaccine, then one essentially is taking a small amount of last year's version of the flu. And if last year's strain of the flu, and if one is taken for measles, a small amount of measles. But given the fact that this is so deadly, it is completely unethical to give a small amount of the virus that causes COVID in order to prevent against COVID. And so this really posed unique challenges for the community, because the question is, how do you develop a vaccine that the body will recognize as the virus that causes COVID without giving that COVID virus itself? And the answer to that, that researchers came up with, is completely ingenious. So we always see the COVID virus as being shown as this ball with spikes coming out of it. And this is actually a pictorial representation of essentially the 4 membrane proteins that make up the COVID virus. And those spikes that you see coming out of it are actually called or known as the spike protein. And what researchers did was they isolated the spike protein, and then they took the very smallest fragment of that spike protein in order to make the vaccine. And what is impressive is that just using this very small amount of that spike protein, a small fragment of the spike protein that covers the outside of that virus, that is enough to build up the immune system, the adaptive immune system, the memory cells, and the antibodies. And Dr. Davis will be covering both the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, and it's being done without at all giving the virus that causes COVID itself. Now, once we've defined what something is, then we can, at that point, really talk about what it is not. And so it's difficult to deal with every aspect of misconception or misinformation. But knowing that this is the mRNA of the spike protein does help us. So no, this is not fetal tissue being used. This is freshly produced mRNA of the spike virus. This is not of the spike protein. This is not any kind of computer-based or tracking system. This is the mRNA of the spike protein. And so now we have this basic understanding, then it helps us then to understand and maybe build on that information, which I'm hoping to do in the next couple of slides. But before that, I did want to address something that is often asked of me, and that is, how could this vaccine be developed so quickly? And the answer is that it was an unprecedented collaboration between scientists, vaccine makers, clinical trial sites, the government, and the Food and Drug Administration. Scientists such as Dr. Colbert were able to discover and publish the genetic sequence of the virus that causes COVID. And in an unprecedented scientific move, they shared that information with all scientists across the globe. Incidentally, Dr. Colbert then worked with Moderna for the development of their vaccine. Then vaccine makers, with that information 9 to 10 days after they had this genetic sequence, began this race to develop effective vaccines. And the reason that they are mRNA vaccines have been developed more quickly is, remember, we're talking about a small fragment of the spike protein. And so developing and producing that small fragment is faster and less technically challenging than trying to develop the spike protein itself. In addition, clinical trial sites just stopped what they were doing and really reprioritized their studies, opening up availability for vaccine testing. And I know this firsthand, that pretty much all clinical trials have been more or less halted within the US unless they deal with COVID vaccines or potential COVID drugs, which hopefully we will also begin to see soon. The government provided incentives, and the Infectious Disease Department of the Food and Drug Administration halted or slowed all of their other activities, looking for their fastest approval process, and then did a robust and thorough review of the tens of thousands of documents that cover the safety, the efficacy, and the manufacture of these vaccines. So now we have a little basis on understanding what the vaccine is and how it was approved so quickly. And now I'm going to move on to just address some of the questions that we've received. One of the first questions is, and it's a good one, is can mRNA alter the DNA? And the answer to that is no. mRNA does not enter the nucleus of the cell. And as you're aware, the nucleus is where the DNA, which is our unique genetic signature, that's where it's housed. Another question is, will the vaccines work on new strains and new variants? And now that we know, have a little bit of basis, we can then talk a little bit from a point of information of whether this will work. So if the variations or the mutations are occurring in any other part of the COVID virus other than the spike protein, then there's a high likelihood that the vaccine will continue to work, right? Because the variations will still have the spike protein, which is what is the recognition factor and the basis of the vaccine. If, however, the mutation is on the spike protein itself, then the likelihood for effectiveness becomes a bit less, right? And it's unclear at that point. And I think that's the angst that we're hearing from our medical and healthcare professionals. They would like to see as many people immunized and vaccinated as possible with the current vaccines, because the faster that this is brought under control, then it gives the virus less time to mutate and less time for these vaccines to lose their efficacy or lose their effect. Another question: it takes about 2 to 4 weeks for the body to build up immunity. And experts are thinking that the immunity will be built up and will stay and remain for about 2 to 3 years. And that's the current estimate or the current guesstimate. However, given how fast this is moving and how little at this point is currently known, experts are believing that this is probably going to be an annual event, kind of like the flu shot. Another question is, if I've had COVID, should I get vaccinated? And the answer here is yes. This is a CDC recommendation. And essentially, this is, I have firsthand information here because my husband is working on a antibody-based test for the COVID. And what he sees is a wide spectrum of degrees of immunity with COVID survivors. And so in order to provide the best coverage, that's why vaccination is recommended, even though you have survived COVID. And then the last question that I'm going to cover in this section is if I've already, concerns about how much coverage do we have with one shot versus another shot. And of course, let's get in there and get the second shot. I know that within San Diego and within California, those who've gotten the first shot, they're being prioritized for the second. But this week, we got a lot of information based on real world analysis. So Israel Israel, which has been leading all of the nations in the world in terms of rolling out their vaccines and getting folks vaccinated, they just recently this week reported that 62% immunity based on the first shot. And then with the second shot, it goes up to almost 100%, between 92 to 98%. And that is similar to also early reports that we've seen both in the UK as well as here in the US. So going back to the question of what should you do? I hope that I've been able to share that the COVID vaccine represents the best that's in science. It's different because it has to be. And it's born out of the collaboration and hard work of so many individuals. And it has really come at the expense of so many individuals. I started this presentation talking about disparity, and unfortunately, I have to end by talking about disparity. And here I take off my professional garb and just speak to you a bit from my heart, because sometimes I feel like a double agent. I cannot tell you the excitement, the joy, and the euphoria that is currently present within the scientific community at the efficacy of these vaccines, and the fact that science and we were able to really apply what is known to a real world and immediate problem. I am personally aware of folks with influence and knowledge and money and privilege who have done their best to get cut in front of the line and have succeeded and are vaccinated. And so this group here is just very excited about the vaccine. And then I go to my personal life, to my friends, to my family, and who are healthcare workers, first line emergency workers, teachers, grocery store workers, senior citizens, and we are unwilling hesitant about being vaccinated. And my real deep concern is that those on the one hand who have the information, who have the knowledge, who have the understanding, that they will get vaccinated and thrive. And then that those of us who are still striving, who are still trying on the back, who are carrying the backs of society, that we will continue to suffer, that we will continue to die, and that the separation between those who kind of have and those who are striving will become even bigger than it is now, and we will emerge from this period even worse than how we started. And so that's my worry, and that's why I'm here. So I've come here to make essentially 3 pleas. My first is please make informed decisions based on the science, based on the facts. You know, in the same way as we would not go to a mechanic to get our hair done, perhaps we shouldn't be going to social media to get good science and advice around medicine. So let's make informed decisions. The second is let's lean into and take responsibility for our own health, because the COVID vaccine is just one part of a holistic picture of health and wellness, of emotional, physical, and health and well-being. And I know for myself, I've spent more time thinking about COVID than I have thinking about the fact that I've completely fallen off my workout program. And it's only February, and we have so many more months to go in this year. I've spent more time, talking and arguing back at the TV than I have spent on deep breathing and meditation. And I've spent more time, being upset about the time that I do need to wear a mask, as opposed to really enjoying the beach and that free open air where I don't need to wear a mask. And so we just, of course, need to ask that our healthcare professionals really provide us with the best advice, but we need to take responsibility for our own health, to rid ourselves of the underlying causes and underlying conditions that cause us not only to be more susceptible to COVID, but to a host of all other poor outcomes. And so let's lean in and take responsibility for our health. And then finally, let's engage. The world is changing, and it has changed more or less forever. And if we don't engage, it will become something of which we don't have a part in and a say in. I like this Jewish concept of repairing the world. And so I just wanted to let you know that I will be taking the COVID vaccine as soon as it's available to my age group. But I also make the commitment to you to make that appointment with the dentist and to get back on my workout program. And my final commitment is to engage. And I make the commitment to engage with you. You can reach out to me personally or reach out to me and I'll send things via the chat. Hoping that, regardless of whether you decide to take the vaccine or not, hoping that together, really together through this change and through these challenges and through these tremendous opportunities, hoping that together we can change the world. I thank you so much, and I'll be answering additional questions at the end of the presentation.